Okay, welcome everyone to today's Title Topics webinar. These are ALTA's free presentations we've been offering every month on issues important to title professionals. I am Jeremy Yowie, Alta's Vice President of Communications, and today we've got a great program lined up today to discuss e-closing trends. Obviously, by the registration numbers, a pretty hot topic. We have almost 800 people. Even though, unfortunately, we scheduled that at the end of the month, so I do want to apologize now. Both our speakers have had busy months traveling the country, attending industry conventions, and it was just a little bit tricky to get them both scheduled on the same day. So here we are, and I apologize, but as I mentioned, the webinar is being recorded. It will be available in a day or so, and you can share with others on your staff or listen if you have to step away for another meeting. While wire fraud has definitely been a hot topic this year, I think it's a safe bet that e-closings has been a close second. We've been seeing a lot of headlines in different parts of the country reporting on various types of digital closings. In addition, there's been a lot of action on the legislative front with bills addressing online notary specifically. So very timely conversation we're going to have. Before starting, I just need to touch on a few housekeeping items. A copy of today's presentation was emailed about an hour ago to all registrants. If you didn't get it, I will send me an email. I will send it to you after the webinar. My email is jyohe@alta.org. That's jyohe@alta.org. You can also download it from the handout section on the GoToWebinar pane. And all participant lines are muted for today's presentation. If at any time you do have a question, use the question box. We'll try to save a little time at the end of the presentation to address questions. Let's see, I do need to thank Fidelity National Title Group for sponsoring our Title Topics webinars this year. Their support allows us to continue providing these educational opportunities free of charge. And with that out of the way, please let me briefly introduce today's speakers. Joining us, we have Eddie Otto. Eddie is Vice President of Corporate Business Solutions for First American Title Insurance Company. And also joining us is John Ralston. John is Senior Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for Black Knight. And we're very fortunate to have both these speakers with us today who are going to be able to share their perspectives on the e-closing front. And with that, I will turn the presentation over to Eddie to get us into the conversation.
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Jeremy. I'm not sure if it's just me, but I'm not seeing a screen share at the moment. John, do you have that up? Or Jeremy?
Yeah, we're still in the introduction.
You are.
Okay.
All right.
All right, well.
Well, why don't you proceed, and I'll try and figure out why that's not showing.
Okay, no problem. And I've got it in front of me, Jeremy, so I'll just cue you as to what slide I'm on as we go. Oh, I see it now. Okay, so jumping into industry trends, before we get going there, Jeremy, if you could advance to the next slide. Some of the folks on the webinar today might be new to the e-closing conversation. I'm sure a lot of you have been keeping your eye on this, but I want to spend a couple of slides to level set on, first off, the different types of e-closings that we see out there. And generally, we can put these into 4 different buckets. The first being a traditional wet signing, which is what we've all been used to for the past 1 or 2 centuries in our business. And that is where 100% of the documents are in paper format. You have either an in-office, a mobile notary public, signing with the borrowers and the buyers and the sellers, or these could also be conducted in a fashion called a mail away, where documents are mailed to buyers and sellers and they are required to locate a notary public in their area and sign in the presence of that notary. So that's our traditional wet signing. And then in the upper right, we've got this term of e-closing called hybrid closing, often referred to just as a hybrid. And this is similar to the traditional signing in that it's in person. Some of the some of the documents are wet signed on paper, and then some of the documents are signed with e-signatures digitally. And these are typically handled in office or again with a mobile notary where a notary public drives to meet the buyers, sellers, and borrowers in person. The third type is also an e-closing, and though the terms aren't quite standardized in our industry yet, this is typically referred to as an in-person digital closing or an in-person e-closing, in which case the notary public is sitting with the buyer, sellers, borrowers face-to-face yet again, but this time 100% of the documents are signed electronically with e-signatures. This also can be done in an office or notary public deployed to the buyer, seller, borrower. And then the last type of e-closing, which is the newest, has a number of different names, but generally referred to as online notary. You might also hear the terms webcam or remote peppered in into that title. So online webcam or online webcam remote notary. And what's new here is that these types of signing is where the notary public is not face-to-face, not in the flesh, not in person with the buyer, borrower, or seller. And instead, the notary public appears before the signers via some sort of a webcam or audiovisual technology. And of course, because of that, 100% of the documents are digital and 100% are signed electronically. So those are just a nice level set of your 4 closing types, 3 of which are e-closings. Next slide, thank you, Jeremy. So just again to level set on the different pieces and parts of an e-closing, it's just important to note all the different concepts that we're going to be touching on today. And this is not an exhaustive list, but this will give you sort of the basics of the anatomy of an e-closing. So the first item is your e-closing room portal, also referred to as a virtual signing room or virtual closing room. And this is typically a website portal where buyers, sellers, and borrowers can review and electronically sign documents through some sort of a browser. The second piece is your e-notary or e-notarization, and this is specifically the digital seal and the digital signature that the notary public will place on those documents that do need to be notarized. The third item is an e-recording, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with. This is recording digital documents electronically with the county recorder's office. And then you have your e-note and e-vault, and it's important just to note that the document, the promissory note in an e-closing, when it's represented digitally, is called an e-note, and it is a special document that is generated by certain types of technologies. And that note, eventually, after it's executed, is stored in a vault called an e-vault. And that e-vault holds the authoritative copy of that e-note, and John's gonna get into the anatomy of that a little bit later, but it's important to note that the e-note is a special document in any closing. Well, I've got 2 more, Jeremy. E-signing is also important here. Obviously, it's the act of electronically applying signatures on these different documents. And then lastly, you have online notarization, which we just talked about. That's the use of a webcam. All right, so we've covered some of the basics, and now what I want to do is get into a few of the trends that we're seeing out in the industry. So the first one to touch on is rocket mortgage, or sort of this rocket effect that we've seen as Quicken launched this new product back at the beginning of 2016. So what happened with rocket mortgage is all of a sudden this concept of digital mortgage, e-mortgage, e-closings got very real. So the Rocket product created a digital process for the loan application process, and that really created a lot of demand and a lot of attention on lenders to be able to have this sort of a digital process for consumers. which gets into the next trend, which is consumer expectations. So I'm sure everybody on this webinar, when they're going to the movies, booking a hotel, booking air travel, maybe even looking at your kids' school grades, you get a digital experience across the board. So consumer expectations are a huge driver in the trends in the e-closing space. And then we get into data standards. So the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie, have been pushing toward a program over the past several years, the Uniform Mortgage Data Program, UMDP. And what this does is it creates a common language across the mortgage industry. And when you have this common language, you create open more doors to more possibilities of integrations, which brings us to APIs. Now, APIs, it's not necessarily important to understand what that acronym means, but the use of modern APIs has created an incredible speed of integration. APIs are the tools that companies are now using to integrate system to system. But these integrations can now happen in weeks, not months or years. So APIs is a huge trend really pressing the adoption of e-closings. And then lastly is the emergence of fintech, this financial technology industry out there. And fintech really can be generally described as specialty technology that companies are creating very specific widgets and very specific functions. And this is allowing lenders to move a lot faster in upgrading their technology and their capabilities. So lenders can now move a lot faster in whether it's catching up with Quicken or building new functions and technology that can quickly be integrated into their existing and older systems. Now, Jeremy talked about some of the headlines, and we are seeing a ton of headlines hit the airwaves. Actually, there might even be more headlines than some actual transactions out there, but these headlines are real. And what I'm talking about is maybe in your market or other markets, you might be seeing headlines around the first digital closing in pick a state, or the first online notary webcam closing in another state, or the first hybrid, or the first this or that. And like I said, there's a lot of headlines, not necessarily a ton of transactions, but they are happening. So this is getting real. The headlines are real. Don't get caught up in them, but this is definitely a trend, and it's moving toward e-closings. The second trend is partnerships. So I was talking earlier about these different pieces and parts. And many of the companies and the vendors out there that you see don't do or don't provide technology that covers all of the pieces and parts. So some of the headlines where you see one company partnering or integrating with another company, it's just basically allowing that company to offer more of the e-closing ecosystem through their platform. One example might be a company that specializes in an e-closing portal, but they don't necessarily do e-recording. So it would make sense that an e-closing portal company would develop a partnership and an integration with an e-recording company. The third item here is lender adoption. So again, back to this rocket effect. As soon as Quicken launched Rocket Mortgage, lenders started to focus on their point of sale, their loan application process, their portal, the consumer experience, and how people start that process with lenders. Instead of by phone or email or on paper, now lenders are focusing on consumers starting their loan process through a portal with an account and a login, and digitizing that entire process of collecting documents and information for the loan application. Now, most of the lenders that we've been talking to have a focus on catching up with this Rocket Mortgage technology. And that focus is probably going to continue into 2018, with the last half of 2018, or maybe a tipping point there toward the end of the summer, where we see lenders start to turn their attention to eClose. But the general trend is that lenders are moving forward to a more digital experience, and eventually that's going to touch our closing process. And then we have, of course, the online notary webcam legislative pipeline. John's going to touch on a few of the statistics and states that have already implemented laws or passed laws. But the point here and the trend we're seeing is there are a lot of states, and I won't throw out a number because it seems to keep changing, but there are a lot of states. We expect many states to introduce legislation in 2018. That doesn't mean that those laws will be in effect, but it does mean that we are going to very quickly, over the next year to 2 years, have a lot of availability in the legality of online notary. And one last point I want to make, because you notice I didn't mention any millennials in our trends, and that is because it is not about the millennials. Certainly, millennials represent a huge buying population in our industry for homes. However, the trends are not specific just to millennials. Everybody expects a digital experience these days, and that is why lenders in the industry in general are moving toward a digital closing. All right, and I'll turn it over to John to cover making the transition.
Thanks, Eddie. And you know, you brought up so many points that I'm going to bring back up as we go through this part of the presentation. But if there's one theme I can make as I go through it, and I would consider myself a technologist, is that technology is not the hardest part of this e-closing process. It's more about the process itself. And what a lot of people don't understand about our industry is that closings are local. There's not a one-size-fits-all way of closing. You know, the way we conduct settlements in Pennsylvania is very different than how they do it in an unauthorized practice of law state like South Carolina or Georgia, as opposed to how an escrow is closed in California. It's not a one-size-fits-all model in order to conduct a closing. And also, and I would say even more importantly, is that we focus in on closing, which is important. I would say it's very much the crescendo that everything leads up to for the last 45 days. But we do a lot of work and interact with consumers many times throughout the process. It takes us to clear title and gather information in order to prepare the deed, or maybe it's a refinance transaction and gathering payoff information. Whatever the case may be, we have to think about closing as just one aspect of the transaction, and we also have to think about e-closing as the entire part, or how we manage communication from start to finish. And I often encourage people I meet with or talk to think about that entire process, how you manage it in your office today, and how you're going to manage fulfillment from start to end. That really means how you're going to conduct your communication from start to finish. So the question that always comes to me is, well, is the closing going to change in the future, right? What's the closing going to look like? And the funny part is, I often say, it's just going to be different, but it's not going to change. And what I mean by that is, there's still going to be a lender involved. You're still going to have your role as a settlement service provider. There's still going to be real estate agents, and there's still going to be buyers and sellers and borrowers involved in the transaction. And you may all still get together in the same room for a closing, or you might not. It really depends on how you want to conduct the closing and how far you want to take it from an electronic perspective, and also how far the lender wants to take it and where their risk profile is from that perspective. But there's one thing I tell everybody, and this is very important. We shouldn't use technology for technology's sake, right? We should be only utilizing technology or changing our process to do a couple things. One is to make a better, more efficient process. And at the end of the day, we should be saving money on a per transaction basis by going down a digital path instead of a wet sign path. I think that you'll find that adoption will be low if we haven't solved the economic problem, that it's cheaper, or that it's not as fast, or it's more laborious to use, right? We have to find something that's easier to use in order to facilitate a true e-transaction. Jeremy, you can go to the next slide. So let's consider your fulfillment process and how that leads up to closing and how you're going to interact with your customers. How are you getting your orders today? Are you getting them electronically through your title production system? Are you getting them via email or fax machine or some other method? Eddie made the point earlier about APIs and digitizing the closing process. Really, it's all about getting that data in sooner and getting that data directly into your title production system so you don't have laborious processes. And how that relates to an e-closing is the fact that if we initiate the process where we're communicating electronically, that leads to an easier transition into the closing, right? How do you engage with the participants today? Do you do that digitally? Do you do that over the phone? Do you do that via email? You know, email is a great tool that you likely have at your disposal. But there are some problems that you have to overcome with email, and that it's not a part of your system of record, it's a secondary process, and that you have to think about security from that perspective. And then finally, you have to think about, how do I interact with lenders today? Because lenders are going to be a big driver, or at least they're going to drive part of that closing process. Do you receive documents from your lenders today electronically? Do you use a collaboration portal to exchange data back and forth to the lender? What's it going to look like in the future? And I think what you're going to see in the future is that lenders are going to maintain more control over their loan documents. They're going to likely create portals, and that you're going to have to interact, and their borrowers are going to interact inside that portal, especially when we move towards the e-note, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And we'll also see that you're going to need to communicate more effectively from a data perspective back with the lenders. We're seeing certain platforms collecting UCD data that Eddie talked about earlier. I think that's just going to become more important and more important through 2018, 2019. So that being said, now let's talk about closing, and let's figure out how we're going to fulfill that closing process. So the one thing that I think is not going to change as we go towards the closings is lenders and settlement service providers are going to have to work together in order to facilitate a closing. That's the way we do it today, and that's the way it's going to happen in the future. Whether you use a portal for that or not, that is really up to you, but we would expect that the lender is going to maintain more control over their loan documents than they do today, in that there's going to be a portal for those documents to be executed. But from a lender's perspective, that's only half of the transaction. You know, people forget about the settlement agent community. We have our documents. You know, we have our title affidavit and owner affidavits that need executed at the time of settlement. But we also have our settlement statement that needs to be effectively communicated to the borrowers. And there's other documents along the way. So we have to maintain control of our documents in the settlement service community as well. We also have to think about how those documents are going to be executed. And I'm going to go back to Eddie's initial slide and just make a couple points. You know, there are 4 methods in order to close a loan that we have to be concerned with. One is the traditional wet signing. I think we all understand that very well. And the next is a hybrid closing that utilizes the e-signing of many documents, but the wet signing of a few documents. And those documents generally involve the note and documents that need to be notarized. And then Eddie went through and mentioned the type of notarization types, be that face-to-face or remote. But between the note and the notarized documents, we have to take special care. And there's certain things that we have to adhere to in order to make sure those documents are executed properly. So in order to facilitate a hybrid close, we really have to take a look at those first 2 document types that are on the screen, whether it's for informational purposes that don't require signatures, or whether they're documents that do require a signature but not notarization. And then we have to figure out how we're going to layer documents that require notarization and then note on top of it from that perspective. We go to the next slide. So a lot of people ask me, where do we start? Well, I would argue that hybrid is a great place to start. And the reason why is hybrid requires a portal and it facilitates the interactions back and forth in order to conduct a settlement, whether that's lender controlled or settlement agent controlled, for those documents that don't require notarization or the note. You can get a lot of lift, and we've done a lot of studies on our side that actually showcase that you can make a better customer experience, and you can also save a significant amount of money by utilizing a hybrid close. And I would often say, you know, don't let perfect get in the way of the good. We all realize that we want to go full digital, but don't dismiss going hybrid to get you on that path in 2018 so that you can effectively run your business. And the reason I make that statement is some lessons that I've learned from our participation in the CFPB eClosing pilot that occurred last year. And what we learned was, by and large, consumers want more information earlier. I think, you know, a lot of closings that occurred today, documents come last minute. They don't have a lot of time to review them. They're just signing rapidly as they go through a closing package. They don't have time to read things. We've got feedback that getting that information to a consumer earlier is more effective, and it really leads to higher customer satisfaction from that perspective. Next thing we really talk to our customers about is, let's develop a plan. It should be easy to use, it should be efficient, and most importantly, it needs to have security wrapped around it. None of us want to be involved in a class action lawsuit or have any of our customers' personally identifiable information released. That can really affect your business negatively. We have to make sure security is thought about as we make that transition from wet sign to full digital. We can't leave that along the side of the road. We have to keep it in our thoughts all the time. Okay, next slide. So let's talk about what needs to occur in order to facilitate a full digital closing. If you go to the next slide, you're going to see that one of the items that has to be taken into account is an e-note, right? And the execution of that e-note has a lot of requirements around it. The first thing I think we have to say about an e-note is that it has to be in a smart doc format. And there's a couple smart doc format changes that are coming on the horizon on how they're going to be interacted with. But most importantly about an e-note to think about is it's not just a document anymore, it's a data-enabled document. So there is data that gets transferred along with this document. And the execution of those documents have very specific standards that must be taken into account. And I don't want to read this to you, but it typically has to be signed in a signing room, and the document has to be placed in an e-vault. And what does that mean? It means that you know who's executing those documents. There are requirements about evidence of who is executing those documents, and it makes a very specific record of that document. And after its execution, it applies a tamper evidence seal to those documents. I would say that by and large, the feedback we're getting from the industry are lenders are going to want to maintain a lot of this data and a lot of these documents in their own system. So this is likely something that the settlement agent community is going to have to interact with through either APIs or through a web portal. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to talk briefly about what happens to an e-note after it's executed. So we talked about the closing part and how the closing occurs. But in addition to that, there is a registration process that has to occur into the MERS registry for e-notes. Then an authoritative copy of that e-note has to be delivered to MERS so that they can keep track of where that authoritative copy resides. The authoritative copy has to be retained in the seller or services vaulting system. And then as transfers occur, the controller and location status of that e-note has to be managed throughout the process. That's important to recognize that after we as settlement service professionals execute that e-note, there's a lot that happens after the case, and that chain of security and that authoritative copy of that note must be maintained all the way through the process. So that's one aspect that we have to recognize to be fully digital. The other aspect that we have to maintain is e-notarization. And Jeremy, if you go to the next slide. I think Eddie did a great job of laying out the two types of e-notarization out there today. Currently, according to our research, there are 15 states that govern face-to-face e-notarization. Those are the ones that you see at the top of the page. There's different technologies that are used across all of those states. There are different requirements. You have to be registered with different offices. Some of them may allow you to go across state lines, some of them may not. And you have to do your own research in each state in order to utilize them. There are also 6 states out there that have passed legislation as it relates to e-notarization, but it's kind of gone dormant, and the secretaries of state of those states may not have given guidance on how to use them. So they're essentially sitting dormant at this point. There are 2 states on the list that you see there that facilitate e-notarization for land records only, but they may not accept e-notarization for any other documents other than those associated with the land records. Now, I think what a lot of people are seeing in the news and what's gotten a great deal of press right now is remote notarization, to Eddie's point earlier. And there are 2 states right now that are really leading the way with remote notarization, Virginia and Montana. Again, you do need to do your research and understand what circumstances they can be utilized in. But I would say that in 2018, you're going to see more states coming online with remote notarization. Nevada and Texas are leading the way in that regard. But again, it's almost difficult to keep up with who's doing remote notarization and bringing that on in the near future. So it's something that you need to, again, manage from a local level. understand what notarization availability you have in order to conduct your settlements where you conduct your settlements. And Eddie, I think you want to say a few words about each of these processes.
Yeah, exactly. And John did a really nice job of starting to break down this this e-notarization in person versus online and what's really happening out there. But I want to drill into this online webcam e-notarization for just a minute, talk about the benefits and challenges. So first we'll talk about the benefits. And I talked earlier about trends. And one of the trends we see, of course, with consumers is their expectations for a more digital experience. And certainly with an online webcam signing experience, that can create a lot of convenience for buyers, sellers, and borrowers. Imagine, of course, being able to sign your loan documents from your home without having to drive across town or down the street or have a stranger, being a notary public, come into your house to execute documents in front of you. So certainly the convenience is there, and done correctly, this can really be a great benefit and a selling point for your company if you can get to the point of offering online notary. Processing efficiency is another huge benefit. So along with consumers and your buyers and sellers not necessarily having to come into the office, that means that you have shorter closing times potentially, you don't have paper, and you're able to shift from one closing to the next a lot more efficiently. So over time, I think initially you may not see those efficiencies, but as you get used to a process of using some sort of a webcam technology down the road, then certainly you're going to experience some production efficiencies in your own office. Lastly is data quality. So whenever you digitize a process and put more controls within the system that's managing that process, you can have a lot more consistency with your information, with your document signing, with your quality overall. So imagine if you're e-signing all docs on a portal of sorts in a closing room, it's very unlikely or maybe even impossible that you miss one of those signatures, or you miss a checkbox or an initial block or something like that in the wet signing world would require rescheduling of signing, which is really inconvenient for everyone. With a digital process, you can have a lot more controls laid out in front of you to make sure that everything is done precisely and accurately at the time it needs to be done. Now, these benefits I don't think will be experienced and realized in the very near term, but over time you can see how this e-notarization and online notary can start to offer those benefits. All right, so now let's talk about the challenges and some of the things that we are going to have to work through as an industry before we can realize all these benefits. And the first and biggest challenge, in my opinion, is this legality and insurability conundrum that we're faced with. Even though we are seeing legislation come along in online notary laws, and our industry players, from underwriters to many agents, are directly involved in trying to get these online notary legislations properly drafted. What we see is that there are many other laws that do affect real estate transactions that have a lot of old language. Some of these laws were written decades ago. Some were written longer ago. And they contain language that refers to documents without any sort of consideration that there would ever not be paper in a transaction. One term that pops up all over legislation and old laws from state to state, one term is original. When you're talking about a digitally signed e-signed document, there's no such thing as this original anymore. So that creates some confusion, and that's where this legality versus insurability challenge comes up. We do need to get to more clarity with the laws. We need to get to more clarity with what types of transactions we can start with in this online notary world. And there's also still challenges when we're e-recording documents. Are we following the established e-recording rules and regulations in that state if it's a native digital, never was paper document? So there's still a lot of confusion around this legality and insurability space. The second big challenge is technology. John was touching earlier on the fact that many lenders are going to want to use their own platform for different parts maybe of this transaction, maybe the entire transaction. And you know, as an agent, that you've got your own title and settlement production system, and you may have to expand into having your own e-closing solution that you can offer out of your shop. So whose e-closing room are you going to be using transaction to transaction? And it really is going to depend on that lender, if they can fully host, or there may be a lender that wants to use your platform directly, or there may be lenders that just don't have any solution and they like you to help them somehow facilitate the entire signing. So technology is going to be a challenge out there. And then, of course, lastly, which always exists, is the people process challenge. Today, you probably, most of the people on this call, today you are signing one way. It is a traditional wet sign type of a signing event. And in the future, you're potentially going to be signing several different ways. When you get to online notary, now you've got this introduction of webcam technology, and how are your people going to respond to that or adapt or feel comfortable with that sort of technology? So there's definitely a people process change function that you have to look at. And these are the challenges that we're all going to have to work through as agents and as an industry to eventually get to online notary. So that said, and Jeremy, if you could jump to the next slide, the legislation is evolving. So I talked about needing that clarity in the laws, and that is happening with the involvement of many of our associations like ALTA, MBA, PRIA, and a lot of the participants, as I mentioned, title agents and underwriters alike, are working on making sure this legislation is going to be good for our industry. So as all those things evolve, we also have to realize there's an inevitability here of moving toward e-closing and online notary. It's too convenient for it not to happen. And I'm not saying that it's going to happen everywhere. There will be a lot of parts of the country where you really won't see this technology for years, and there's other parts of the country where they're already seeing it today. But there's an inevitability that eventually this is going to become very common. That said, the agent's role is more important than ever, and you need to have an open dialogue with your lenders and your vendors and your underwriters so that you know and you can stay ahead of the curve on what is available in your area, what will be insured, and how you're going to interact with your lenders to provide e-closings and eventually this online notary solution. So just really in closing on this online notary, done correctly and with the proper legislative language and with the proper technology in place, it can actually be incredibly safe and possibly even more secure than what we're doing today in person with wet signatures on paper. But it's also very easy to cut corners on those technical requirements and process requirements that really are out there to protect. So as we evolve through the laws and we see more technology become available, we have to remember that our industry's role is to protect consumers, protect their data, protect their money, and make sure that we also protect lenders and protect their lien position, not just at the time of recording, but off into the future. John, I think you wanted to dig into the e-person e-notarization now.
Yeah, and it's much the same, and I think everybody can read them on the screen. And I would say that electronic notarization is really just a electronic form of likely how you're conducting your business today, right? You're utilizing the same process, it's the same face-to-face experience. We just see the improvement of data quality in using it. I want to make sure we give the group time to ask some questions. So So if we go to the next slide, Jeremy, I'm just going to make a brief point here. And I like to call it the e-closing cascade effect, right? And what you can do and what you can't do from an e-closing perspective. And I look at it this way. You know, you have to make sure the consumer wants to interact electronically, because at the end of the day, e-sign and UITA govern all of these transactions, and the signer has to be given an opt-out ability so that they can sign the documents in a wet format if they so choose. And I promise you that will remain the case in the future. So you can't forget how to wet sign documents and how to do those closings. But you also have to make sure that the lender wants to utilize this technology. You need to make sure that it's good with your underwriter. You can record your mortgages and your deeds at the local county recorder's office. That, you know, if you can't secure a lien position, there's really no point in this, right? And the list goes on and on. So I think that as an industry, we're breaking a lot of those barriers down, and we can get you further along with E than we could, say, 2 years ago. And I see that dramatically changing over the next couple of years, to where the tipping point on that seesaw may go on the other way. We're doing more electronic than we are paper. I think we would all like to see that. But one of the main reasons why we're doing this, and Jeremy, if you want to skip ahead a slide or two, is really about processing times and costs. And we at Black Knight did our own study that you see here. It was a time and motion study of what occurs in the closing process, and Eddie alluded to the quality associated with the digital close. All of that is baked in to this analysis that you see on this document. But it really breaks down what your closing packages entail, what processing times you can see to implement as you go from a hybrid close all the way to close. But most importantly, there are a couple points here. One is, even in a hybrid close process on the settlement side, you can save money. And it only gets better the more digitally we close that loan. But you'll note that whenever we institute a note, that's where a lender gets the big benefit. So if you ask me what's the main driver towards E, it's really the lenders need to pick up this efficiency by digitizing their product or their process and improving their quality throughout. And you know, it's going to drive us forward down this electronic path. But there's benefits for the settlement agent community all the way through. So that being said, we could go to the next slide. I think, Eddie, you wanted to talk here.
Yeah, just really in summary, just we see some indications that are pointing toward this late 2018 into 2019 transition toward e-closings of all the types that John and I talked about in the presentation. That, of course, won't happen at the same speed in every single market, but generally speaking, across the U.S., that seems to be the trend that we're seeing. So the remainder of 2017 and beginning 2018 is your time to plan and prepare. And I put a note on here about experiments. I think if you did try to do a hybrid closing in a certain area today, of course, under the guidelines that your underwriter provides, and there will be tech.
Oh, hey, Jeremy, did we lose Eddie? Okay, well, I'll tell you what, I think Eddie may have had some technical problems, but I'm just going to pick up where he left off while he's dialing back in. You know, I think Eddie brings up a very good point. You have to work with your underwriter. You have to make sure that all of the requirements that are being met locally in your state jurisdictions and really nationally, if you reach the national footprint, are most definitely being taken into account so that you can effectively close a transaction and utilize the benefits that e-notarization brings.
Hey, John and Jeremy, I think I may have lost audio. I'm not sure at what point.
No problem, Eddie. I think John picked up the ball here and
Okay.
talked through how to prepare here on this slide. We can go ahead and transition, go to the next slide.
Okay, Jeremy, did we want to make time for some questions here? I know we had a few more slides of preparation, but I think people can probably consume these on their own.
Yeah, I was going to suggest the same. You know, yeah, if everyone wants to review the bullet points on how to prepare on the different parties you may interact with, whether it's your underwriter, your vendors, your lenders, your employees, there's a good summary of bullet points on what to do to have that conversation. If you'd like to dig into that further, you know, the contact information for both speakers is on the last slide. So maybe if there's anything else you guys want to touch on these last few slides, then we can move to Q&A.
There is one that I wanted to hit on, Jeremy. On the very last slide where we had talked to your employees, one of the last item which is highlighted there is develop an expert. And I think that's a really important takeaway for all the agents listening in on the call today. It's listen in on other webinars, make phone calls to your lenders, vendors, and underwriters, attend webinars and conferences. Do what you can to have a person in your office who's really going to become your e-closing expert. And it will take a person to start to develop a deeper knowledge so that as you're evaluating software or you're trying to identify certain transactions later into next year that you want to test, you've got somebody who's really becoming well-versed on the topic. So that would be, if there's one takeaway to point out, that'd be mine.
All right, John, anything to add on before we move to Q&A?
No, I think it would be good to get a few questions answered.
Okay, all right. I'm going to try and sift through the barrage of messages that came in when we lost Eddie. So let me try and quickly get through those, filter them out. You guys touched on it a little bit, as you know, these closings are local and really governed by a state by state basis. But what should a title agent, settlement agent tell their customer who has requested an online closing where they may not be allowed to do that currently? Any advice on the conversation they should have?
Well, that's a really good question. I think it would be important to note to their customer. So obviously, their customers heard about something, and they're requesting this digital experience of some sort. And instead of just saying we can't do that today, I think it'd be important to share that this is a relatively newly and more widely adopted type of closing, and that your agency is working on evaluating the technology that you need to have in place. But at this point, for the safety and security of that particular client, I would suggest to continue with a wet signing, and but certainly for future transactions to consider your agency as you're exploring this heavily at this point.
All right, the questions are coming in rather quickly. We'll try and get through as many as we can over the next 5 or so minutes. Kelly had a question, and this is kind of the conversation we had when we were prepping for the webinar, is going through maybe just some of the vocabulary. John, could you talk through what a smart doc format is and data-enabled document?
Sure. So there are new MISMO, and I'll introduce one term to you before I answer the question. MISMO is the data governance body that our industry utilizes. And right now they're working on 3 distinct formats for smart docs. And I think the third one is coming online, or we're waiting for an opinion as we speak before it comes online. But before I get too technical and put everybody to sleep, the easiest way to think about it is it's a data-enabled document. So especially with a version 1 smart doc, it's an HTML representation of a document, but that document is drawn from data that's sitting behind the scenes in order to facilitate a view of that document. There are changes that are occurring. In the future, you're going to see PDF-enabled data smart docs. But really think about it, the easiest way to think about it is it's a data-enabled document that can be tamper-evident sealed so that there's no possibility of any changes occurring to that document after execution sealed.
I had a few questions. People on the call would like some advice on where do they turn to find this technology. You know, at Alta, we've got to be vendor agnostic. You know, maybe I encourage you to reach out to either the 2 speakers. You know, both are experts in the field, and probably could give you some good advice and perspectives on who might be a good fit for you. You know, correct speakers. You know, John, Eddie.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. If folks want to reach out directly to me or to John, we can talk a little bit more in depth about what precisely their needs are and help them navigate some of the information out there.
Yeah, and another question about information. See, Ralph asked if we could get a state-by-state listing of what is allowed in terms of e-notarization, or remote notarization, e-recording. I think, Eddie, as you mentioned, it's kind of a changing space landscape right now. I don't know if there is a good source right now that kind of gives kind of an up-to-date lay of the land.
Well, there's a challenge with that. So I think that's going to be a conversation that each of these agents are going to, or that's going to be information agents should begin to expect from their underwriters. It's not just about where can I do X, Y, and Z. It's and what are the details behind what my underwriter is willing to insure. And the details get into transaction types versus the different types of e-closing types today. How many signers are involved? That is a factor that plays, and there's several others. So I know that at First American, we are actively and diligently working on that sort of a matrix, so you can identify where you can do what. But beyond that, John, can you think of any other information that would start to get them closer?
The only other thing that I would say is, I think you give the best advice, talk to your underwriter. There is a MISMO work group for the, I talked a little bit about MISMO earlier, associated with e-notarization, so that we can really work on getting a good firm data standard across the industry. You may want to look that up.
Yeah, good advice.
It's very technical though.
Yeah, but good advice. Reach out to your underwriter and have conversations with them. You'll see a lot more from Alta on this space as well. Alta is working with NBA to collaborate on some model legislation to provide the states that may be looking to adopt online notary laws. We are at the top of the hour. A few questions, John, about your study on the costs and expense you could save there on doing hybrid to the full digital close. Again, feel free to reach out to John. He can give you more color on that. Let's see here. Interesting question, a little bit not specific to eClosing at the moment, but blockchain. Can't ever have a technology discussion without mentioning blockchain these days. Do you guys see this as a possible vehicle for ensuring security of e-notes or any documents for that matter at some point in the future?
I think that's a whole nother hour of discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing.
Okay.
Actually, that may be a series.
I think so. And one more. You guys mentioned Quicken and the Rocket Mortgage. And John, I haven't heard any jets flying over you, so thank goodness for that. But any other lenders that you guys are seeing, drive this conversation?
I would say, well, go ahead, John.
Well, no, Eddie, I think he laid it out very good up in one of his initial slides. And the fintech providers are really starting to engage up in the front end of the process. And I'm not selling anything here, but they've actually been some have been working with us in order to get the to start that electronic mortgage interaction up front. So I think a lot of fintech providers are going to be ones leading the way.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just to add back to the some of the trends that we're seeing later in 2018, you'll see a lot more of the larger lenders with new consumer products in relation to loan origination. Maybe not all the way through to eClose just yet, but there are numerous teams and all the usual players at the lender levels that are working toward this change in point of sale and loan application and on through the rest of the process. So I think we will start seeing and hearing more later in 2018, and it'll, I think, start to happen pretty quickly on into 2019.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Eddie and John. Great information on eClosings. Hopefully, everyone on the call, learned a little bit more about the digital transaction process today. As I mentioned, if you missed parts of today's webinar or you think others in your office would benefit from listening, recording of the presentation will be available for replay in a few days. We'll send an email with a link to everyone who registered, and you can also access all of our webinar archives at alta.org/title topics. Looking ahead next month, we will avoid the end of the month for scheduling a webinar. I believe it's November 16th, where we will hold our next webinar will be on the finalized TRID amendments that this CFPB issued in July, and which went into effect earlier this month in October. And with that, that will bring us to the conclusion of today's presentation. Thank you again, John and Eddie, for participating today. And
thank you.
And I'd also like to thank Fidelity once again for sponsoring today's webinar. I hope all the listeners found the presentation useful. Take care, everyone.